as we know, the chair could go against the recommendation of the parliamentarian. That's why I appreciate our current chair in this committee saying she would follow whatever the recommendation of the parliamentarian is or has been. Not so in the Senate. So whatever we take up is going to end up getting through the parliamentarian in the Senate unless the majority leader Schumer decides he doesn't want something to be part of the bill. So anyway, this there is so much complicated about the immigration bill, and I've got another amendment that deals like with the rollover of immigration numbers. Well, they're already rolling over. And this needs a thorough vetting. It needs to be thoroughly looked at because, for example, if the 140,000 designated employment visas are being completely used, or are not being completely used, rather, well, then under the law currently, those roll over and become family visas. They don't go unused. They're used one place or another. And yet this bill is, and again, we'll get into this in another amendment of mine, but it's just an example that this really needs to be looked at and thoroughly discussed, and not one amendment late at night like this. It needs to be the focus of legislative hearings where we see what's actually happening. But this bill, provisions on immigration within the reconciliation bill are actually going to create the ability to have more amendments, almost as if cut out of whole cloth, because they're not going unused. They're flipped over. If their family visa's unused, they flip over into the employment. If their employment not used, they flip into the family. So this is creating all kinds of problems. And so this amendment simply says we're striking the immigration language. A reconciliation budget bill has no business having such a complex effect on our immigration policies, and especially not when we've got people pouring in here from Afghanistan that we have no records on. We don't know who they are. They don't have birth certificates. The Taliban has their records if they have records. So I feel like if we don't slow down on this issue of immigration, then the next 9/11 or whatever date it happens on commission report will come back to this hearing and say they rushed through this. They opened the door to all kinds of problems when they should put the brakes on here. And look, I've got 15 seconds left. It's not right to do this. And as far as here late in the game, late in the day, we ought to have a thorough talk about it. And I had 4 hours of amendment by myself.
The gentleman's time is expired.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. This amendment strikes the entire immigration title and the important investments in our human infrastructure that it makes. Therefore, I urge opposition to the amendment. And I yield back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does Mr. Biggs seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support this amendment. It gets at the heart of something that I would say probably 8-9 hours ago, we raised, and that is the germaneness of sticking an amnesty bill, an immigration bill, in a budget reconciliation package. It seemed to me then that it was not germane. It seems to me now that it's not germane. And I think the gentleman from Texas, Mr. DeGomert, raises salient issues. I mean, the fact that we're talking about spending billions of dollars and at the same time granting amnesty to between 8 and 10 million people seems absolutely ridiculous that we're compressing that particular issue, one that has been festering and mulled about for years, but without conclusion. Maybe we should have been having a hearing on this to discuss this more completely, more fully. I feel like we've at the same time that we've crammed this thing through, there's been so many additional amendments that would be necessary and they've been routinely heard and dismissed without, in my opinion, serious debate. Just a modest debate, position saying no, we're not going to do it. But here's the deal. I'm going to request, Mr. Chairman, that an article called entitled "Taxpayers to Foot Bill for Amnesty" under House proposal dated September 11th be admitted into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if we're even going to get to some of the other amendments that I had and others still have, I know. But here's the thing I'm looking at. Secretary Mayorkas, for instance, and it's something we should consider, he said in one of his speeches that he was going to make dignity of foreign migrants foremost in his efforts. And he also claimed that the rule of law was a foundational guidepost for him. And then at the same time, we saw the dismantling of the MPP program. We saw a dismantling of the agreements with the Northern Triangle states. We saw a dismantling or a weakening of Title 42, which is why you get over 30,000 unaccompanied children come across in June and July alone, because that was a change he made to Title 42. We saw the stop of the construction of the fence. And we saw a guy who really isn't committed to the rule of law. He's not committed to enforcement. In fact, regarding enforcement, we have 1.2 million people illegally in this country with the removal orders. And he told ICE that he didn't want them to make enforcement a priority anymore. That's from the Homeland Security Secretary. I mean, when you start looking at that, the gentleman from Texas's amendment starts to make perfect sense, because his amendment gets at the fact that this is not germane. No matter how many times you can try to dress it up and say, oh, we're talking about economics. You're not talking about economics. That's not mentioned in the bill, this ANS we've been considering. And you're not giving this particular policy issue the full consideration it needs. Now, we've talked about things, but let me tell you, this is a complex issue. Immigration has always been complex and always controversial. And it is one that we should take, in my opinion, an approach that has more gravitas than what we've seen today. Mr. Chairman, I encourage everyone to support the Gohmert Amendment, and I do, and I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'll yield to, who am I yielding to?
Massey.
Mr. Chairman, I yield to Mr. Massey.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify something. I think I heard Chairman Nadler call this portion of the bill that Mr. Gohmert seeks to strike, he called this illegal immigration portion human infrastructure. Is that correct? Is that the term?
Time of the gentleman has expired. Who else seeks recognition?
Mr. Chair.
For what purpose does Mr. Jordan seek recognition?
To yield to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Massey.
Massey's recognized.
Yes, if the chairman would indulge me, I'd like to know if he just used the term human infrastructure to refer to the portion of the bill that Mr. Gohmert seeks to strike with his amendment.
I did.
So illegal immigration is now human infrastructure. I don't know what to say. This is, I think the people back home are going to be surprised to learn that illegal immigrants are now part of the infrastructure of this country. The terminology here is almost too incredible to believe. I just wanted to make note of that illegal immigration is now being referred to as human infrastructure. And I'll yield back.
Yield for a question.
I got to yield to Mr. Jordan.
Yeah, we now have illegal immigration as human infrastructure. We have a reconciliation bill that has amnesty in it, and we have a reconciliation bill that doesn't cut spending but actually increases spending. So everything is wrong. Everything is wrong about what's going on here. Every single aspect of it is wrong. I appreciate the gentleman from Kentucky pointing that out. We'll yield now to the gentleman, I believe the gentleman from Texas, who's the sponsor of the amendment, this good amendment. Mr. Goldman, I will yield to him.
Well, and I appreciate my friend, Mr. Jordan, and appreciate Mr. Massey raising these issues. As we all know, infrastructure requires vast amounts of investment, and it also requires, rehabilitating that infrastructure and redoing. And so since we've seen the Department of Defense say that, gee, it's important to the good order and discipline to have sex change operations, I'm wondering what kind of money is going to be required to remodel the human infrastructure that the illegal aliens represent. I mean, this is how absurd this is getting. Once we declare that illegal immigrants, people coming into this country illegally, are our infrastructure, then you're talking about massive investments. No wonder this bill is going to cost $3.5 trillion. It is incredible. And when we talk about, well, this is economic, we keep hearing that. We have all day today heard about how great this is for the economy. But if you look at realistic studies, people at the Heritage Foundation had years ago, and the last report I saw indicated before we started hitting 100, 150, 200,000 people that are actually being caught in a month coming in, they were projecting $135 billion a year that it costs taxpayers, doesn't help the economy. And then when you talk about, if you look, the last jobs report was an embarrassment to the Biden administration because there were only a couple 100,000 instead of that 720,000 that were being projected. And now you're going to bring in people from other countries. It makes no sense. And I'll be glad to yield back to Mr. Jordan that yielded to me or Mr. Massey, but this is incredible. We should not be doing this. This is just so wrong. Let's pass my amendment, and then we can come back and deal with immigration on its own.
Yield to the gentleman.
People yielded to me.
Yield to the gentleman from Wisconsin. Did Mr. Tiffany, Mr. McClintock, or Mr. Bishop? I yield to Mr. Bishop from North Carolina.
Thank the gentleman from Ohio, and I think to Mr. Massey's point, or his dumbfoundedness at the use of language in this way, talking about human infrastructure and so forth, that redefining language on the fly is not something that has historically been associated with positive developments in governance. Let's put it that way. And it's very disturbing. But the deliberate misuse of language to manipulate is unfortunately common.
Purpose, does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
To strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Lady's recognized.
I won't take the whole 5 minutes, but I think this amendment is a terrific mistake. And I just think a couple of points need to be made. First, Mr. Gomert indicated that under current law, if the visas aren't used, they just roll over. That's not correct. if employment visas, and these are,
That's not what I said.
well, you said they roll back and forth, and that's not correct. Employment visas that are not used by the end of the fiscal year expire. As a matter of fact, there's quite an uproar in the country right now because of the backlog that was created during the prior administration. And even though using overtime and extra efforts, there's probably going to be 80, 90,000 employment visas that expire at the end of this fiscal year. This amendment changes it. Now, these aren't people coming into the United States. These are people already here. And I know quite a few members of this committee voted for the per-country cap bill in the last Congress. We have a situation where you got people, medical doctors, in the middle of the country. They're here legally. They have medical offices. They're providing medical care. And yet they can't, because of the way we structured our system so stupidly, they can't ever get from legal temporary to legal permanent. And some of those people, I mean, their kids are aging out because they're dependents. And so their children, when they turn 21, they're being told to go back to their country of their birth, even though their parents are in the United States. So there's families. We had a hearing about this in the subcommittee. There's very strong evidence that a large number of very talented people are leaving the United States because you can go to Canada and get the equivalent of legal permanent residence in 6 months. And these are very talented people that are serving real needs throughout our community. I remember in the last Congress meeting with a physician and his physician wife, and they had a small medical office in a state in Iowa, as a matter of fact. They were the only doctors in the town. And but their kids were 18, and they were thinking they're going to have to close their offices. They couldn't send their kids back to a country where there's no family. So I think there's been a lot of mischaracterization about that, but that example, in a way, explains why this will be so important for the economy of the United States. It's not just physicians, but it's people with postdoctoral degrees, people who can start businesses to employ Americans, and we can't, and they're here. They're here, but there's no way to get them permanent legal status. This bill fixes that. We've talked about the dreamers, people brought in as babies, and I've met hundreds of these kids, maybe thousands of these kids. A lot of them didn't even know that they weren't United States citizens until they went to apply for a loan or some benefit they thought they were entitled to as an American citizen. It was only then that they found out that they actually weren't born in America, that they'd been brought here as a baby. These and many others will be able to unleash the full talent that they have to help build our economy. This is going to be such a shot in the arm for the GDP and for the American economy. And I remember Mayor Bloomberg saying that one of the keys to turning the economy of New York City around, it was in the dumps when he was there, was immigrants coming into that city and revitalizing a whole neighborhood, starting businesses. And I've had mayors in little towns that are rusting away saying what they need is that entrepreneurial spirit to come in, because immigrants start businesses at more than twice the rate of Americans. So let's not throw away the economic opportunity that is in this bill by adopting Mr. Gomert's amendment. And I've gone on longer than I planned, Mr. Chairman, and so I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Who else seeks recognition?
Mr. Chair.
For what purposes Mr. Roy seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank the chairman. I appreciate the amendment being offered from my colleague from Texas. We have found ourselves, of course, today having a number of amendment discussions involving border security, immigration related matters because it's such a pressing issue. And obviously those of us who recognize what a harm is befalling our nation as a result of wide open borders in terms of the empowerment of cartels and the endangerment of the American citizens and the endangerment of the migrants who seek to come here. We'd like to actually do something about that. We've had votes on background checks. We've had votes on that we shouldn't have any effect here until the migrant protection protocol is re-implemented, given that a federal judge said that we should re-implement it. Money for a border wall. We had votes on mandating that we ensure that people with sex offenses or multiple DUIs are not given status or firearms conviction. We've had numerous other votes, sanctuary cities, host of votes, all voted down. And so now my colleague from Texas, I think, is rightfully saying what we all said at the beginning, which is that we shouldn't be legislating on policy matters as we are here in the context of a reconciliation bill. This is the same kind of action that divided the country coming out of Obamacare, where you try to backdoor in a procedure to try to defeat the 60 vote threshold in the Senate by forcing something in, a square peg in a round hole, and saying we're reconciling. That's just not occurring here. This isn't reconciliation. This is policy making. This is that we all get the joke. Everybody gets the joke. This is to try to jam policy through on 51 votes. That's what it is. Okay? Those are the facts. So I appreciate the gentleman from Texas, my colleague, offering this amendment to try to at least somehow put a foot back in the door of actually focusing on reconciliation. I would note that my friend from Kentucky's proper observation that we're now talking about, quote, human infrastructure, an absurd terminology, which is essentially, at least I now know why my Democratic colleagues don't give a rip about the little girls getting raped in South Texas right now, or the dead bodies in counties all along South Texas, the 89 dead bodies in Brooks County, the 70-something dead bodies in the Del Rio sector, the skull found on a ranch in South Texas because it was picked apart after dying in the Texas heat. Don't seem to care. Why? Because apparently we view these human beings as chattel. What more can we think when we refer to them as human infrastructure? What the hell does that even mean? But we're treating these human beings as some sort of political tool, political football. They're dying in South Texas. Ranchers that I talked to last week who are calling 911, sometimes effectively saving a life, often not. Having to then go watch a human being die on their ranch that they've had in their family for years. Happening in real time right now, but nobody in this committee on the other side of the aisle wants to talk about that. Why not? Because it isn't comfortable? You don't want to talk about those things? These are human beings, or are they human infrastructure? I'm sorry. I don't know what the term is right now. But that's what we're dealing with here. Instead of any kind of seriousness of having a real debate about the policy choices. I hear my colleagues on the other side of the aisle talking about DACA as if we don't live DACA all day long, every single day in Texas and border states. And my colleague from California, of course, a border state, and understand that human reality that we've had a failed, broken border for decades. And now human beings are facing the consequences of that. But what my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will never acknowledge is the extent to which the continuation of those failed policies makes our country weaker, makes our country worse off, undermines the very migrants who seek to come here, undermines Central America, undermines Mexico, empowers cartels, eliminates our ability to stand up against China. Also, Democrats can pat themselves on the back in the false name of compassion, saying, look at me, I like brown people, they don't. And it's such unbelievable crap. Go down and talk to the people in Laredo like I did last week. Hispanic Democrats who are just furious, as I said earlier, where is Joe Biden? Where is the administration while our city is under assault, while our ranchers are under assault? So I applaud the gentleman from Texas offering this amendment, and I support it. Now I yield to the gentleman from Texas anytime I have left.
You have none.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Benz, for what purpose does Mr. Benz seek recognition?
You. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gomert.
You there, Louis?
Can hear you, Louis.
Mr. Gomer, you're on mute.
All right, thank you. I appreciate my friend, Mr. Shabbat. Look, when we're talking about an economic shot in the arm, let's look at what these very policies have done to the human infrastructure already here in America. I was shocked to recently see that during the 8 years of the Obama-Biden administration, that Black Americans lost 30% of their net worth. Incredible. But what was happening? We were bringing in people, they were pouring in illegally into this country, and there really wasn't much border enforcement back then. And then we saw why there was a huge uptick in Hispanic Americans and Black Americans voting for Donald Trump. Why? Because as President Trump, when he was candidate, asked, what do you got to lose? Well, a lot of them realize, a lot of Democrats realize he's got a good point. What do we got to lose? And then we saw the wages cease being stagnant, which is what happens when you pour in more and more workers. Sure, it's a real economic shot in the arm for people that come from countries where they were making slave wages, if any. They come here and they make more money. But what does it do to the Americans, to the people of all colors, of all national origins that came here legally? Their wages get crushed. They stagnate. And now with the inflation that this administration is bringing, for every month so far, we have a report for the last 7 months under this administration. Every month, people are losing value of what they're worth and what they're making. This is a tough start to this year. And if this passes, if this becomes law, then you are going to devastate the people that live here. And especially as this inflation keeps going, I mean, it's going to be worse than the Jimmy Carter years when we had double-digit inflation, double-digit unemployment, and double-digit interest rates. I couldn't believe it, but I was in the Army at the time at Fort Benning, Georgia, and I heard this guy Reagan talking about, no, we can bring all three of these double-digit numbers down. I told my wife, I like the guy, but he doesn't. I don't see how anybody can make that much difference. But his policies coming in brought all three of those double digits down, and now we're going back in that direction. It didn't work when Gerald Ford was trying to whip inflation now. It created more horrors for people just trying to get by during the Carter administration. And all he could do was come on television and tell everybody in winter, wear a cardigan and turn your heat down. Look, we're headed right back there. And a huge start to that is with inflation going on, bringing in hundreds of thousands of new of workers you're calling human infrastructure, and Biden's already promised them cash right out, and we're hearing them being promised Medicare, just get here illegally. Look, this is a disaster. Let's put a pause. I'm really begging, let's put a pause. I know you're in the majority. You can do what you want because you are the majority, but think about the people in this country whose wages will hurt, their net worth goes down, more unemployment with inflation. Please, let's think about the people that are here and let's help them by putting a pause on the immigration part of this budget bill. And with that, I yield back to my friend, Mr. Shabbat, and I appreciate the time.
I didn't actually yield the time, but I think
Sorry.
one of our other colleagues did. Yeah, I was.
Yes,
I was
that's right. That's right.
Cliff, you can
I
reclaim
do
it.
move, and I do move to strike the last.
You got
word.
5 seconds, Chris.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Chairman,
Time has expired. The question occurs on the amendment.
Mr. Chairman,
All in favor,
Chairman,
say
move to
aye.
strike the last word.
All in favor, say aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Or opposed, say no.
Mr. Chairman, you're not going to allow us to at least complete this amendment?
The noes have it. Do I hear?
You're not going to allow us to at least
hear a
complete
motion?
this amendment?
Hear a motion to,
We don't get to
Definitely, we want a recorded
speak on
vote,
this
but we actually wanted
amendment?
to
recorded
talk on
vote
the
is
amendment.
requested. Recorded vote is
This is
requested.
outrageous.
Oh.
Now you shut down
Clerk will
debate after
call the-
bringing a bill
Clerk will
before us
call
that doesn't have anything to do with the budget.
Recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Move to strike the last word. Unbelievable.
Mr. Nadler.
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren.
No.
Well, no one's called the
Ms.
question.
Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee.
Mr. Chairman, parliamentary inquiry. Who called
Ms.
the
Jackson Lee
previous
votes
question?
What cut off the debate?
Yeah, we'll cut off the debate.
The chairman moved the previous question and ruled on his own previous question, apparently.
The roll call vote is underway. The clerk will continue to call the roll.
no. Mr. Cohen.
No.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
No.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch.
No.
Mr. Deutsch votes no. Ms. Bass.
No.
Ms. Bass votes no. Mr. Jeffries. Mr. Cicilline.
No.
Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell.
Nope.
Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu.
No.
Mr. Liu votes no. Mr. Raskin.
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal.
No.
Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Stimmings.
No.
Ms. Stimmings votes no. Mr. Correa.
No.
Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon.
No.
Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia.
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse.
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath.
No.
Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton.
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean.
No.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Escobar.
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Jones.
No.
Mr. Jones votes no. Ms. Ross.
Ross votes no.
Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush.
Bush votes no.
Ms. Bush votes no. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Shabbat.
Aye, and note my objection to the chairman cutting off debate.
Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Gomert.
Aye.
Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Isa.
I second Mr. Shabbat's recognition of this wrongdoing and vote aye.
Mr. Isa votes aye. Mr. Buck.
Aye.
Mr. Buck votes aye. Mr. Gates.
Aye.
Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs. Mr. Biggs. Mr. McClintock.
Aye.
Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Stubbe.
Yes.
Mr. Stubbe votes yes. Mr. Tiffany.
People are not infrastructure. Aye.
Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Mr. Massey.
Aye.
Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Roy.
Aye.
Mr. Roy votes aye. Mr. Bishop.
Aye.
Mr. Bishop votes aye. Ms. Fishbach.
Aye.
Ms. Fishbach votes aye. Ms. Sparts.
Yes.
Ms. Sparts votes yes. Mr. Fitzgerald.
Aye.
Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Benz.
Yes.
Mr. Benz votes yes. Mr. Owens.
Aye.
Mr. Owens votes aye. Mr. Biggs, you are not recorded.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
Mr. Biggs, you are not recorded. Mr. Biggs votes yes.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
Mr. Jeffries, you are not recorded.
Jeffries votes no.
Mr. Jeffries votes no.
Is everybody recorded who wishes to be recorded? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 19 ayes and 25 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman?
Ms. Escobar?
Mr. Chairman, I move the previous question on the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
The question is on ordering the previous question on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. This motion is not debatable. All in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed say no.
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 The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the previous question. The recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren?
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee? Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen?
Aye.
Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Deutsch?
Aye.
Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Ms. Bass? Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline?
Aye.
Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Mr. Liu?
Aye.
Mr. Liu votes aye. Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal?
Aye.
Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Stemmings?
Aye.
Ms. Stemmings votes aye. Mr. Correa?
Aye.
Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon?
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia?
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse?
Aye.
Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath?
Aye.
Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton?
Aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean?
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar?
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Jones?
Aye.
Mr. Jones votes aye. Ms. Ross?
Ross votes aye.
Ms. Ross votes aye. Ms. Bush?
Bush votes aye.
Ms. Bush votes aye. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Shabbat?
No.
Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Gomert?
No.
Mr. Gomert votes no. Mr. Issa?
No.
Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Buck?
No.
Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Gates?
No.
Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock?
No.
Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Stubbe?
No.
Mr. Stubbe votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey?
No.
Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Roy?
No.
Mr. Roy votes no. Mr. Bishop?
No.
Mr. Bishop votes no. Ms. Fishbach?
No.
Ms. Fishbach votes no. Ms. Sparts?
No.
Ms. Sparts votes no. Mr. Fitzgerald?
No.
Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Bentz? Mr. Bentz votes no. Mr. Owens?
No.
Mr. Owens votes no.
Mr. Chairman, recorded.
Mr. Jeffries, you are not recorded. Mr. Jeffries?
Mr. Jeffries? How is Mr. Jeffries recorded?
Mr. Jeffries is not recorded.
Is Ms. Bass recorded?
Ms. Bass, you are not recorded.
It's an amendment or final passage?
The previous question.
Aye.
Ms. Bass votes aye.
How am I recorded?
Ms. Jackson Lee, you're recorded as aye.
Mr. Jeffries votes aye.
Mr. Jeffries, you have to turn on your camera.
Mr. Jeffries votes aye.
Mr. Jeffries, you have to turn on your camera.
Chairman, how am I recorded?
Mr. Jeffries, you are not recorded, and you will have to turn on your camera.
My camera not on? Tim? How am I recorded?
Mr. Jeffries, you are not recorded, and you will have to turn on your camera.
I was Swalwell recorded.
Mr. Jeffries, you have to turn on your camera in order to be recorded.
Lord intercede.
This is Madeline Dean. How am I recorded?
Ms. Dean, you are recorded as yes.
Thank you.
This is David Cicilline. How am I recorded, please?
Mr. Cicilline, you are recorded as yes.
How is Swalwell recorded?
Mr. Swalwell, you are recorded as yes.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
Ms. Escobar, you are recorded as yes.
How am I recorded?
Mr. Stanton, you are recorded as yes.
Madam Clerk, how am I recorded?
How am I recorded?
Mr. Raskin, you are recorded as yes. Ms. Scanlon, you are recorded as yes.
Okay, the clerk will report.
Well, no, we actually, I think Hakeem actually just, his camera just came on. Madam Clerk, how am I recorded?
Mr. Jones, you are recorded as yes.
Mr. Jeffries?
Mr. Jeffries votes aye. Mr. Jeffries votes aye.
His camera's not on.
Mr. Jeffries.
There he is.
There he is.
Mr. Jeffries.
Jeffries votes aye.
Mr. Jeffries votes aye.
Quite a build-up for us to get to see you.
Mr. Jeffries votes aye. The clerk will report.
Thank you.
Ms. Stanton.
Mr. Chairman, there are 25 ayes and 19 noes.
The ayes have it, and the previous question is ordered on the amendment and the nature of a substitute. The previous question having been ordered on the amendment and the nature of a substitute, the vote now occurs on agreeing to the amendment and the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
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 The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment and nature of a substitute is agreed to. Recorded vote? Okay. A reporting quorum being present. The question is on the motion to transmit the reconciliation submission and all appropriate accompanying material, including additional supplemental dissenting views, to the House Budget Committee pursuant to Section 2002 of Senate Con Resolution 14. Those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
Aye.
The ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to.
We'll take a recorded vote on this.
Recorded vote is requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler.
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren.
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee. Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen.
Mr. Cohen votes aye.
Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Deutsch.
Aye.
Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Ms. Bass.
Aye.
Ms. Bass votes aye. Mr. Jeffries.
That's my notepad.
Mr. Jeffries, you'll have to turn your camera on.
Aye. Jeffries votes aye.
Mr. Jeffries, you'll have to turn your camera on.
It's on.
His camera is on.
His camera is on.
I see him.
Mr. Jeffries.
Okay. Jeffries votes aye.
Mr. Jeffries votes aye. Mr. Cicilline.
Aye.
Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell.
Aye.
Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Mr. Liu.
Aye.
Mr. Liu votes aye. Mr. Raskin.
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal.
Aye.
Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Stimmings.
Aye.
Ms. Stimmings votes aye. Mr. Correa.
Aye.
Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon.
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia.
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse.
Aye.
Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath.
Aye.
Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton.
Aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean.
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar.
Finally and absolutely, aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Jones.
Aye.
Mr. Jones votes aye. Ms. Ross.
Ross votes aye.
Ms. Ross votes aye. Ms. Bush.
Bush votes aye.
Ms. Bush votes aye. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Shabbat.
No.
Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Gomert.
No, for those who will be hurt by this bill.
Mr. Gomert votes no. Mr. Issa.
No.
Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Buck.
No.
Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Gates.
No.
Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs. Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock.
No.
Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Stubbe.
No.
Mr. Stubbe votes no. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey.
No.
Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Roy.
No.
Mr. Roy votes no. Mr. Bishop.
No.
Mr. Bishop votes no. Ms. Fishbach.
No.
Ms. Fishbach votes no. Ms. Sparts.
No.
Ms. Sparts votes no. Mr. Fitzgerald.
No.
Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Benz. Mr. Benz votes no. Mr. Owens.
No.
Mr. Owens votes no.
Has every member voted who wishes to vote? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 25 ayes and 19 noes.
The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. And with that, this meeting is adjourned. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Without objection, the committee print will be transmitted as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute, including all adopted amendments, and staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. This concludes our business for today. Thanks to all our members for attending. Without objection, the markup is adjourned.